Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome you here in the room and online to the workshop Circular Economy Policies in the EU and Selected Countries. The workshop is organized by the Swiss Academy of Engineering Sciences and the World Resources Forum. I'm here in a triple role. I make the intro. I should moderate the session, but fortunately, Emanuele will do this. And then I will have to speak also the part of Swiss Academy of Engineering Sciences, since Christian Holzner, who was foreseen, could not make it. Then we go to the next slide. Just short was what was the intention was understand and clarify latest developments of sea policies at EU and selected countries level, then concept for implementation, time horizon, environmental impacts, indicators and monitoring, and learnings, of course, from the different priorities. Next slide. It's really wonderful that we have four presentations from the regulator level. First of all, Peter Jensen will present the EU view. Then we will have from Austria, from Brigitte, on the Austrian perspective. They have brought out a circularity strategy just last year. Then we will see the German position by Timon, and he will also cover international aspects. Also, they are working on a strategy for Germany, and they have a position paper. And third, we will have Niklas Nierhoff from the Federal Office of Environment. Also, Switzerland had a lot of regulatory actions, as you see on the right side, a lot of interpellations in the parliament, and they are on the way of processing. We will hear more about it. Then we hope that we have then the report on the gap report, circularity gap report, which was out in the 6th edition. And you see here should have the next slide, please. The circularity as it is defined, it was in 9.8, then 8.6, 8.6, 8.6, 8.6, and for 23, 20 even down to 7.2. I hope we'll hear more about this from Matthew Fraser. There are also circularity reports on the country level. In 2019, there was the one from Austria with 9.7% circularity. Then the one from the Netherlands with astonishing 24.5%. Then we had the one from Norway, which was also astonishing with a low 2.4%. This is it seems that the fossil fuel part plays an important role, since the circularity is only 2.4%. And then also Switzerland came with their circularity report with 6.9% in 23. I hope we will really get some information with this from Matthew Fraser. Here you see now how we will go on with the presentations, and I just heard that everyone will need a little bit more for the presentation part. It will eat away from the discussion part. First, Peter Jensen from the Environment Agency, then Niklas Nierhoff from the Swiss Federal Office for the Environment, then Tim Leopold from the Federal Ministry for Environment, then Brigitte Karigel from the Austrian Environment Agency, and then Matthew Fraser on this circularity gap report aspects. And then I will do it instead of Christian Holzner, this project we had where we also talking about indicators. That's all for the intro, and I would first of all, Peter, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. And I guess this is a microphone that we're using. Could I have the slides on, please? Good morning to all of you in the room. Good morning to everyone who happens to be online. My name is Peter Jensen. I'm from the European Environment Agency, and I will give you a very brief overview of some work that we did, trying to get an overview of circular economy policies in European countries at the request of the European Commission. Next slide, please. The point was not so much to do a checking of whether the mandates of the EU is actually being implemented, but rather to see what can we learn from each other, where are experimentation being done. So that was the mandate, the scope of the analysis. We covered all of the EU countries, and we also covered, EEA covers more than just EU countries. So we also covered Switzerland, Turkey, and Kosovo with the study that we did. Oh, I can do it myself. Much better. And just a few highlights out of this study here. One of the things was to try to look at how many countries are actually developing a circular economy framework, how many are developing an actual strategy. And what we can see very briefly here is that generally, oh, I can't point. Doesn't look too well. What we are seeing is that starting back in 2016, countries started to develop these frameworks, and gradually countries have been coming online with frameworks, learning from each other. The ones that are encircled with red are the ones that have then later updated their framework. And what we are seeing is that countries are starting by setting very, very generic aims at we need to do something on circular economy, and then gradually they're refining that into much more concrete policies. So it is an evolutionary process of trying to develop this. One of the things that the way the study was done was that we sent out a questionnaire to relevant authorities in all countries, and we asked them about all of the policies because we don't have enough local knowledge to cover all of that ourselves. And one of the questions was, so are there circular economy elements in other policy areas? So what is the integration that you're working with? And I would have expected that something like waste management, they would say that waste management, there's circular elements in all of that. There were 17 countries that could find circular elements in their waste policies. I think this is illustrative of something that's been raised in a number of different sessions over the last day and a half, that we are not really sure what we talk about when we talk about circular economy. People have different ideas about what circularity is, and therefore, no, waste, that may be something else seen in some countries, whereas others say, well, that's an integrated part of our circular economy policy. So this lack of understanding of what it is that we do, I think, is an important recognition here. There are quite a few countries that are collecting a lot of data, but there are very few countries that actually do, so to say, a more formalized assessment of where that takes them. And mainly that is linked to the fact that they have very few targets. They are basing themselves a lot on the circular economy monitoring framework of the European Commission, which, as I think most of you know, was set up in order to utilize data that was already available. It was not something that was designed to say, this is a circular economy, what data do we need in order to assess that? It was rather saying, what kind of data do we have lying around? Can we say something about circularity? And with that in mind, there's a missing element there as well. Also, just another example, the circular material use rate, which is one of the few actual targets that exist. We should double that by 2030. countries are implementing or interpreting that in different ways. And let me just point out a couple of examples. Finland wants to double their circular material use rate in line with EU policies, but they don't say which reference year, which of course makes it a little bit easier to meet the target. Ireland just want to stay above the EU average, which is also the way we saw the numbers for the circularity gap report, which is not exactly the same measurement, but still staying above an average that's going down may be a rather easy target to meet. So again, there's still an enormous amount of work to be done in defining what it is that we mean when we talk about circularity, because if we can't measure it, we can't manage it. So with that, we try to say, well, what are some of the challenges and barriers? The report is available for everyone. You'll get a link here at the end. So I'm not going through all of them. I was given 5 minutes. I probably already spent them. But just this, the very broad definition of circularity is one of the key challenges, is that we are not really sure what we talk about. And even within different sectors, people may be talking about very different things when they talk about circularity. So there's a lot of room for, so to say, greenwashing companies that call themselves circular, but without actually being so. There's also a lot of the competition between circular and linear practices. It's a challenge to find ways of taxing the linear versus the circular. So those were challenges that were highlighted by many of the countries. And if we then look at some of the recommended and proposed solutions, again, this is a survey of all countries. So it's not just us saying this is what should be done, but it's rather what countries say needs to be done. What they were pointing to very much was this idea about working much more together to find out what do we mean by circularity, really having that much more well-defined. And at the same time, they looked at some very concrete elements of trying to shift much more to service models and things like that as ways of trying to get closer to things that are circular. Now, I'm not going to dive into a lot of national experiences because you will hear that from the countries, but there's a wealth of information. And as a very last aside, I can say that we are expecting that there will be an update of this overview produced next year, so towards the end of next year, as part of the environmental policy implementation review. So more to come, and we will probably be following this up over the coming years with regular updates every 3 years, something like that. And this is the link where you can find both the country profiles for all of the 30 countries that are covered, plus you can find the summary reports where you have all of this information. There's also in one of the posters hanging downstairs, there's a link. I think there's a QR code that goes directly to the report. Was that fast enough?
Very much, and good morning, everybody. My name is Niklas Nierhoff. I work for the Swiss Federal Office for the Environment. And I started with sustainable consumption and production footprints, then went to the Green Economy report, which once was an action plan and strategies. Okay, is it better? Yeah, thank you for the heads up. Great, and yeah, I was working on the Green Economy report, and then the Parliament picked up the ball and initiated a parliamentary initiative on the circular economy, which took a lot of aspects of the green economy and then put it into the circular economy framework. Could I have the slides, please? Thank you very much. And as many of you probably know, Switzerland has a rather strong waste management framework since the 1980s. There is a ban on landfilling since the year 2000. There are several EPR systems in beverage packaging, batteries, and electronic and electric equipment. There are several high recovery rates for materials from paper and cardboard, metal and steel scrap, some building waste, dismantled and excavated materials, biogenic waste. There is a private collection of textiles, and from 26 onwards there will be phosphor recycling, and at least that's the plan. And from 2028 onwards, the landfilling of tarmac will be banned. So that's also on the agenda. Still, this is being contrasted by very high per capita municipal waste and high material consumption in Switzerland per capita. And still, even if we recycled all the waste that we have, we could only cover about 1/5 of our material demand. So, which shows that in the end, it's also about reducing absolute material consumption. And the circular material use rate that Peter has been referring to is, according to the official statistics, 14%. According to the GAP report, about 7%. I think it would be very good also to sit together and like work on the indicators, and that they are solid, and we can communicate them together and find the right indicators and the consistent indicators. So if we see this contrast of high environmental footprints, material footprints, waste, and the history of material recovery, we see that better framework conditions are needed. That's also one of the findings of the National Research Program that has been finalized a couple of months ago, and the National Research Program Sustainable Economy. And before I go into that, I will say something about other existing complementing framework conditions that we have. So there's a tradition of industry agreements, for example, in the area of food waste, which has also clear targets. It's monitored, and at the beginning it's voluntary measures, and depending if they're met or not, there will be additional measures from 2025 onwards. There is also the Sustainable Development Strategy, which bases on the Agenda 2030, where we have the goal of reducing food waste by half until 2030, which is great, and which also led to this industry agreement that we have, and possible regulation following. There are like different other areas which are important as complementing, for example, in the area of education, sustainable public procurement, where there is a knowledge platform and a toolbox, for example. And in the area of education, we also already have some projects. And last but not least, something that Xaver referred to, we have quite a lot of analysis and reports which are like motivated by parliamentary requests or by the federal government. However, this is not yet a policy or regulation. It's usually the foundation of possible regulations. Here I come to the potentials that we have. It's quite packed, this slide, but on the left-hand side, you see like the big potentials and the greenhouse gas footprint of households. It's important to note that gross fixed capital formation is not part of it. So the construction sector, you can't see it in here. It's not part of housing, for example. We have the big three. We have nutrition, housing, and transport, of course. And then we have other sectors and textiles. I guess textiles would move up more if you deducted food from health and restaurants, for example, which is quite a big chunk there. On the right-hand side, you see selected circular economy policies and their reduction potential for greenhouse gas emissions taken from Maja Wieprechtiger, who looked at this in her PhD thesis at ETH Zurich. And she finds also that food waste has a significant potential for the circular economy. So it's great that we already addressed that. And then the construction sector, steel and concrete, and which I find also very interesting, is insulation materials. So it's not yet addressed. Also, the private sector is working on it, and we're doing a lot for plastic packaging, but the same amount as PET bottles is like found in insulation waste each year. I think that would be interesting to look further into that in the future. I also want to mention the solvents, so the chemical industry below. Later on, you will Brigitte will say some words upon the green chemistry. And from what I heard, there is not much data and information on it. So maybe the potential there could be even bigger. So to conclude, also something that Peter has shown on his slide, circular economy is surely important, but it should be combined or even integrated in sectoral policies. So for example, what's not shown by the reduction potential by Wieprechtiger, car sharing in the aspect of mobility or nutrition. You could also, in our strategy for high impact products like animal products, could be reduce or refuse. In the housing sector, you have reduced floor space. So that's all behavior and consumption circular economy aspects. Now I come to the parliamentary initiative and what's going on the legislative level at the moment, sorry. And Parliament has already developed a good draft, and I think the Environment Committee of the Council of States is going to address it after the election this autumn. And on the one hand, it aims at strengthening like legal technical aspects of the circular economy in the Environmental Protection Act. So it's anchoring circular economy, preparation for reuse, strengthening the waste hierarchy on a legal level. And then there are some specific measures, but subsidiary measures. So they don't necessarily have a direct regulation or ordinance following. That's in the area of eco-design, where we have the eco-design directive, eco-design regulation coming forward from the EU, probably. And this would give us a basis to take over EU regulations in Switzerland. And there's another subsidiary article, which is in the area of construction, where the Federal Council could take actions in the area of circular economy in construction. And there are also specific measures. One is to integrate online trading in EPR systems. So nowadays, if I buy a radio in a shop, I pay also an advanced recycling fee. If I buy it online, I don't pay that. And Parliament wants to change it. And the other thing is, which would be very specific, is limit values for gray energy for buildings. And I will say a couple of words on the next slide. But before I say that, I wanted to mention cooperation and also subsidies for information and training, which I know also in Austria is one of your focus points. And this could be a basis that the federal government and the federal administration supports more private initiatives and projects. And last but not least, public procurement and the exemplary role. And something I find worth mentioning, and is pretty cool from my point of view, is referred to the Climate Protection Act, which has been decided by the Swiss voters this June. And Article 10 of this act says that the federal administration should be at net zero life cycle emissions in 2040. So since the circular economy is all about the whole life cycle and reduce materials and emissions, this would be a very strong and will be a very strong incentive for the circular procurement, but with the target indicator, which is at the impact level. So as promised, the last slide for the building and construction sector, which is of great importance from a circular economy point of view. It's about 10% of the Swiss greenhouse gas footprint. And if you look at the material footprint, it's even more extreme. So sand and gravel, which are mostly used by the construction sector, make up more than 50% of the RMC raw material consumption. So if you have the target, the target to reduce the material footprint by 20%, so you could like achieve a big chunk of that just by reducing primary sand and gravel use. But in the end, you wouldn't have really significantly reduced greenhouse gas emissions or other environmental impacts, since recycling concrete is not necessarily better than normal concrete from an emissions point of view, unless you recarbonize it before you use it. So there is a high potential to reduce emissions for buildings. And on the left-hand side, you see a graph. You can reduce it by 50 to 60% if you combine the measures well and you're well trained. It comes from a publication of Nova Energy and Carbotech. And you can incentivize doing so with limit values, for example, gray energy, which is part of the draft legislation that I presented before, or by setting limit values for greenhouse gas emissions over the whole life cycle, or the embedded emissions, which is being done by Denmark or France, which is being discussed in the EU for the Energy Performance in Buildings Directive, and to conclude, is already implemented in law here in the canton of Geneva as the first canton in Switzerland, but is not yet put into force since the regulation is being drafted as far as I know. Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you also for the kind of invitation to this relevant event. My name is Timo Leopold from the German Ministry for the Environment, and I know time is short, so I will dive right into the matter at hand, which is the German National Circular Economy Strategy and a couple of examples of our activities on the international level. So as you all know, Germany is a very big economy, which leads to a very high demand for natural resources. Some of those resources we have in Germany, some of them we don't. For example, for a lot of metals that are crucial for the digital transition or also climate technologies, we are in many cases up to 100% dependent on resources. So these imports obviously also then come with a degree of environmental responsibility, because they have in many cases a large environmental footprint over their value chain. So we have both an environmental but also an economic incentive to explore circular economy more profoundly. And against this background, it was that in 2021, the new German government in its coalition agreement wrote that we have now two goals in the space of circular economy. One is to reduce the consumption of primary raw materials, and the other is to close material cycles. Obviously, those go hand in hand. And this coalition agreement also specified the instrument, which is a new national circular economy strategy. And here I would also like to point out the quote by our minister here, which really says that circular economy can and actually must be a driver for environmental protection and climate action. So that is to say, and we've heard this in previous reports, but also I think that links back to many of the things we've heard in the plenary discussions. Circular economy is not an end in itself, but it should serve a greater purpose, which is to tackle the environmental crises we're facing. So this process now has started of the development of this national circular economy strategy. We're in the middle of the drafting process at the moment, and the publication is expected in the course of next year. Just very quickly to give you an overview over the key areas that we want to tackle. Many of those areas that you see here are part of the classics in terms of product groups or materials, such as plastics or textiles. You know them, for example, from the Circular Economy Action Plan of the EU Commission, but they also pop up in obviously other strategies by other countries. And then there's also a couple of overarching areas that we want to tackle, such as public procurement, which has been mentioned already, or circular production processes. As you see, I'm going through a bit quickly, but maybe we can dive into more detail in the discussion. So obviously, we also want to measure what we're doing. At the moment, we have the lead indicator of our national sustainability strategy and also our national resource efficiency program, which is the total raw material productivity. In this graph, it's the dark red line you see, which shows a bit of progress, basically the amount of economic activity we are able to produce per unit of resource. There's a bit of progress, maybe not enough, but also the issue with this indicator is that it doesn't say much about circularity, at least not explicitly. We've heard from Peter about the circular material use rate, for example, and we're looking into this one, for example, to also accompany the indicator framework and accompany this indicator that we've had in the past. This really links a bit back. This slide links a bit back to, sorry, this one links a bit back to this quote by the minister I showed you earlier. Unfortunately, the graph is in German, but what it does is it basically shows several sectors of the German economy and the distribution of the GHG emissions over the value chain, so upstream, midstream, and downstream. And the important part in this graph is the light blue bar. Those are the Scope 3 emissions, which are the upstream emissions that can be addressed inter alia through circular economy. So with circular economy, some of those emissions could be cut off or mitigated, which again shows the great climate change mitigation potential of circular economy. And for example, in the middle of this graph, you see a couple of quite resource-intensive sectors, such as metal processing or so, where a lot of the emissions come from the beginning of the value chain. And I already come to my last slide with a couple of, or two examples of our work on international level. Again, this nexus between circular economy and climate change mitigation, that's really a topic that we focus on very strongly. It's great to see also those numbers from Switzerland. So apparently, this is a topic that's important for many people who work in this circular economy space. And our effort is really to go beyond the circular economy bubble and also engage with the climate space. And one example here you see it on the left-hand side is one of the outputs of our G7 presidency last year. It's the Berlin roadmap of the G7, which I was working on very intensely. And it's basically the guideline for the G7 on circular economy and resource efficiency for the next couple of years. So it's really, it has hopefully an impact over the next couple of years. And I'm not going into detail here on this one, but you can find it online. You can also contact me if you're interested on this, but only one thing I would like to highlight, that in this roadmap, the G7, and those are obviously the biggest industrialized economies, they recognize that the goals of the Paris Agreement are impossible to reach without further progress in terms of circular economy and resource efficiency. And then it also includes a couple of measures, what we do now with this, now that we know that the Paris Agreement cannot be achieved without this further progress. This links also to the second example, and that's my last point, a side event we organized at last year's Climate COP, the COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. The side event was called Beyond Decarbonization, Tackling the Triple Planetary Crisis Through Systemic Resource Efficiency and Circular Economy. So again, this climate nexus was a big focus. We organized this together with the International Resource Panel and the 10YFP. It was a brilliant collaboration. And I think the picture might show you a bit what we were aiming to do. So on the right-hand side, you see our minister, Steffi Lemke, on the left-hand side. You see Jim Ski, who back then was the co-chair of the IPCC mitigation working group, and now obviously is the chair of the IPCC. And he was on the panel and gave brilliant remarks together with the other panelists on why we really need to bring circular economy into also the climate space. There's me lurking in the background, but probably not so important. But happy to maybe, if we have time in the discussion, to give a bit more details on what we actually discussed. There's also a summary of this event, and I'm happy to share it. And on this, yeah, these are my contact details. If you're interested and want to know more about our work, my work, then don't hesitate to contact me. Thank you.
So, good morning. I'm Brigitte Karigl. I am working with the Austrian Environment Agency, and I've been working with this agency since 1993. So this means long before circular economy became even a term for discussion. And I personally started with waste management planning, waste monitoring. And now we do know that waste management was one of the starting points for circular economy. And today, yes, I will present you the Austrian circular economy strategy and how we came up with the strategy and how is the status of implementation. Can I have the presentation, please? So we started working on the circular economy strategy in the year 2020, and we did it in a participative process. So what was the framework for developing the circular economy strategy? We wanted to focus on the focus points which were addressed as very important in the European circular economy strategy. Then we made an assessment. Do we have any possibilities in Austria to tackle the problem? Do we have instruments do we have any instruments to achieve circular economy targets? This helped us to shape the framework. What do we mean with this? We do not have any direct influence on the production of specific electronics in Asian countries. So it was not, so this was not in the focus of our work, but what we could influence, we could tackle public procurement or procurement at all. So to strengthen procurement of green products. And then we invited representatives from stakeholder groups in the construction sector, textile sector, and so on. And we made discussion rounds to identify what are the main problems, targets, what would be measures to strengthen circular economy approaches. And when we had this material, we analyzed this material to come up with a circular economy strategy which would fit for Austria and where we could identify instruments to achieve our goals. Can I have the slide with the goals, please? Okay, I will talk about the goals. Of course, we have strategic goals, and the strategic goals are closing resource flows as far as possible, and to reduce the resource consumption. And we were aware, of course, that the circular economy goals are very strongly connected with the climate protection goals, that production of primary materials requires energy, and so that there is a close linkage between resource consumption and energy consumptions. And so we have our Minister for Environment, she says, and it has been mentioned before, we will reach our climate targets only when we reduce the consumption of primary resources. And so from these strategic goals, we tried to identify operational goals. So we didn't want to stay on this generic level. We want to reduce resource consumption. We were asked to come up with figures, with measurable targets, so that we would be possible to measure and to monitor progress or not any progress in achieving the goals. And we started, of course, with an analysis of the Austrian situation. Well, how is our resource consumption in which area? And it is similar to Switzerland that more than 50% of the domestic material consumption is of non-metallic mineral resources, which fits very nicely with Austrian land use, which is very high compared to other European countries, which goes hand in hand that the area of commercial area per person is very, very high in Austria. And of course, our road infrastructure is also very high. And so we came up with concrete reduction targets for material consumption. And our goal is, which is really ambitious, to have a domestic material consumption of 14 tons per capita until the year 2030. And maybe you will ask yourselves, how did we come up with this goal, with this figure? So on the one hand, it is more or less the average of European countries. So it should be in some way or another realistic. And how to achieve it? We made calculations. How much material reduction can we expect from the reduction of fossil energy carriers and from achieving the climate targets? And on the other hand, we made very ambitious assumptions concerning the reduction of the use of primary raw materials for construction. So 14 ton per capita is very ambitious for Austria, and for the year 2050, we have a target of 7 tons per capita and year, which is less ambitious than the European target, but our today's knowledge is this would be a sustainable material consumption. And maybe what's in our circularity rate, according to European figures, is 12%. And by reducing the consumption of primary materials, we would come up with an increase of the circularity rate to 18% by 2030. So this percent point, it's only 6 points of increase of circularity rate, but this is a huge challenge for us. And finally, I think I will make my presentation without slides. We have a target for reducing the material flow through households, and which was also a very strong political discussion, because imposing waste prevention targets for households, it was, for me personally, it was very surprising that politics agreed with such a target, because this would have a massive influence on consumptions and retail. And what we do see, of course, our focus areas are reduction of food waste and prolongation of the use of products. And we have a very strong focus on reuse of products. So, okay, I think I have to speed up. Our instruments are, I will go very quickly through the instruments, legislation and regulation, and I will give there some examples. We have newly legislation which is under work, is end of waste for excavated material. So we have very huge amounts of landfilling of excavated material. We want to reduce it by setting clear end of waste criteria. We have an ordinance which forbids the landfilling of gypsum walls. Sorry, I don't know the word now. Rigips, maybe you know it. Yeah, plaster walls. And this, the idea is by prohibiting landfill of this, it would be put the pressure on recycling of this material. And why is it so important? When the incineration of, we do expect that we will have less gypsum, which is results from flue gas cleansing, from incineration processes. So we have to build up secondary resources for these gypsum walls. Circular procurement, our ministries have put strong pressures on all the state institutions, also on us, to speed up with green public procurement, and we are more or less under close supervision of the ministry to spend our money in green public procurement. And what we do see in Austria, that the state institutions, they have a big influence on the market, on what is bought and what is produced. We see it in the green public procurement, but we see it also in the construction sector, because residential buildings have a lot of funding from public money. And yes, I will go to some other implementation measures. We have funding programs for research, technology, and innovation. There is a funding program dedicated to circular economy. It's 45 million funding for research. Maybe for Germany it would not be so much. For Austria, it would. It's not. It's quite a sum of money for research, and the funding initiative from the European Recovery and Resilience Facility is also used for circular economy issues. We have promotion of repair, because what we do see, repair is very expensive for the private consumers. And there we have a program which funds consumers to have their electronic goods repaired. And it's the so-called repair bonus. But what I can share with you, the experience, this repair bonus was implemented, and within a few weeks, we had the first frauds. And so this, so it's always interesting, what are the reactions to such funding programs? And now this repair bonus is reshaped to, yes, to put a barrier to frauds. And the promotion of reusable beverage packaging, and there will be a funding for bottling plants and reverse vending machines and sorting plants, because we in Austria, we have a major problem in achieving the targets for plastics recycling, and one way out is strengthening reuse of drink bottles. Green chemistry, we do know that information and education is crucial for implementing circular economy in all our lives. We have a new master program for green chemistry. This is already has come into force, started in the winter semester last year. And we have a platform for green chemistry where the chemical industry participates, and they are, but I must say, this is still at quite an early stage. There is a national work program for strengthening green chemistry, but it's at an early stage. And for waste prevention, as I said, prevention of food waste and reuse and repair, there are also accompanying measures, social enterprise. So this is a social enterprise initiative with the aim of supporting reuse and repair on many levels. And I think this is quite successful. I think it can be compared with Flanders. It's there's also such a strong initiative. And industry, what we did observe, that major concerns for industry is the supply with raw materials and, of course, energy supply and emissions of greenhouse gas emissions. And we do see that industry sees all those three problem areas together, And a very recent development is that a task force between the Ministry of Climate and the Ministry of Economy and industry, major industry representatives have been founded to tackle the issue. So industry is very much involved in circular economy issues. Thank you. And I think later on you will receive my presentation.
Thank you very much, Brigitte, for an excellent presentation. It's really a pity. She has wonderful slides, and we will see that you all will get them. But it was an inconsistency of items. One applause once more. And I think let me praise her. It's not going to be here. No, I don't know what happened. So, and could you pull up my slides? We will have them. Of course, the discussion will be shortened. I'm now speaking as the head of the topical platform, Sustainable Circular Economy of the Swiss Academy of Engineering Science. And it was the idea that Christian Holzner, who is a scientist at SATW, would present it, but he did not make it today. So next slide. It is a project which was initiated by Bruno Oberle, former managing director of the Federal Office of Environment, of IUCN, and the president of the World Resources Forum. The topic was, or the start was analysis of the environment inventory of the Swiss circular economy and interviews with stakeholders. It was carried out by Manuele Capelli. He's also here. I think he's not in the room, but he is also at the conference. And then evaluation of existing indicators as SWOT analyst by Professor Katrin Greif. I know she was here yesterday. I don't know whether she's here today. And the vision and goals for the Swiss circular economy. And most importantly, a proposal for a set of new indicators. We also thought about future steps, monitoring concepts, modeling, application to specific materials or sectors. And the project was delayed since many things happened. You have heard them now. In Austria, the strategy, in Germany, a lot of work on the European level, and we wanted to include it into the project. So next slide. Here is from Katrin Greif, her presentation, the various circles which you should consider, beginning with rethink, reuse, repair, remanufacture, and then all the things with design, usage, collection, processing, recycle. And the goals would be reduce resource use, that's the first, and reduce emissions, reduce material waste, increase renewable share, increase product reliability. For the indicators, the next slide, was put up, let's say, a qualification. Number one, method and data are available. And we have heard from Niklas that we have sometimes certain inconsistencies between various set of data. Then less good method is available. Database is available, but must be made usable. And then three, that's getting worse. Methodical approach is developed, databases has to be created, and methodological approach still needs to be developed. The indicators shown can be reported for all material flows, but also specifically for certain material, such as building materials. Now, to the indicators which we have taken into account. It's on one side, we are beginning with the measures, then the impact, how it is called, and then the indicator. And at the right column, this quality, let's say, the priority. First, of course, first thing is reduce, or the first thing would be rethink, but then reduce. There you have the domestic material consumption, DMC, the raw material consumption, RMC. Then extend the stocking rate, the repairability, the product lifetime. There you have also adequate indicators, but you see they are less common, less prioritized. Then closing the cycle, circular material use rate. We have heard it before. Material which is reused, which is used in the GAP report, recycling, processing efficiency rate, recovery rate with adequate indicators. And then the reduction of the environmental impact, low carbon, greenhouse gas footprint, resource conserving, total environmental footprint, UBP, it's a Swiss indicator, retained environmental value. Niklas was also mentioning it. And then also important, we have heard this also from Ernst Ulrich von Weizsäcker, reduction of biodiversity loss, which means the biodiversity footprint. But again, there the priority would be, Katrin is just arriving. I just showed you a slide before. And then one important thing in all the things is there should be also cost considerations. What is this cost of the impact reduction? There are many initiatives which are costing a lot of money, and the reduction of the environmental impact is not very good. Now coming to another element of indicators. In the ISO world, a lot of work is done with a whole family for circular economy. Actually, these drafts are discussed just now in Stockholm. There have been ISO draft international standards on 5904, which is circular economy terminology, principles and framework for implementations. Then 59010, circular economy guidance on business models and value networks. That's it's a difficult standard. A very important one where you have all the indicators in, but a huge amount of indicators is circular economy, measuring and addressing circularity. And then is also, that's not yet ready, the circular economy product circularity data sheet. And last but not least, there is Sonia Valdivia is working on this. She's also here. She's a scientific officer of the World Resources Fund. Secondary materials principles, sustainability and traceability requirements. A lot is going on, and it has to be brought in line with all the initiatives which are done on the various countries. To summarize and conclude, there is a great variety of indicators, including ISO 59020. They should be easily be applied and internationally accepted. And I think there is quite some work to do. The goals should be reduction of environmental impact and reduction of resources use. The cost of the measures should be taken into account. So there should be a balance between most impact with lowest cost. Cooperation of business and regulator is important, as also mentioned by Niklas. And the whole credibility is important. The danger of greenwashing has to be avoided. That's known since years, but Peter was mentioning it. It's happening. And as we have heard this morning in the plenary session, sufficiency goals are needed in addition. And last but not least, we have to conclude this project by end of this year. And I think that today's workshop will have an important input on our final report. So thank you very much for your attention. And we will go over now to the plenary, to the discussion, which will be handed over by my Emanuele. Thank you. So please. And we will begin with some questions to us by Emanuele, and then we will open the floor. We will make this first round rather short.
Indeed. Thanks a lot, everyone, for being here again, and both here in the room and online. And thanks, of course, all of you for all the presentations. I have to start with some apologies to Brigitte, which is the worst way to start moderation, but sorry that the slides didn't work, but hopefully we're going to be able to share them later. Maybe just to make up for that, Brigitte, one question for you. Now we heard several perspectives from the public sector. How does the industry, the private sector in Austria feel about the CE strategy you put forward? And what kind of indications did you also get from them about what's required for them to advance further in circularity?
Thank you. Does it work? Yes. As I mentioned in my presentation, industry is driven by concerns about raw material supply, energy consumption, and greenhouse gas emissions. And I would like to give you an example. We have in Austria, we have a in the field of iron production. We are changing the technology from blast furnace production for iron to using a material where we don't need coal for producing the iron. This means that we will have the blast furnace slag. We won't have it in the same quantities as today. Blast furnace slag is a very important secondary raw material for the cement production. So we see the effects of climate protection measures on the raw material supply, and industry is putting a lot of efforts and research and puts money into the research for changing the raw material supply to use other material for the concrete production. So, and we see quite some examples. This is just one example, and for industry, this circular economy questions combined with climate protection is very important. And so there was this task force on circular economy, which was founded recently.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Birgit. That's very interesting. We have limited time, so I'm going to get to the difficult question. I'll try at least, and I'll start with you, Peder. We saw this graph. Actually, that's maybe a double question together. So we started with a couple of graphs which are quite interesting. One was the increasing in the uptake of circular economy framework, which is, of course, good news. What I found a bit less good news was the graph showing in which other policies the CE comes in. So there was waste management, which, of course, is part of the maybe a first step, can be seen as a first step towards circularity, or starting using circular approaches and thinking. But it was particularly staggering for me, the lack of circular economy policies in raw materials policy and also in industrial policy, so industrial strategy. Maybe on the circular, on the raw materials, the Critical Raw Materials Act actually speaking in a different direction, is speaking about circularity to decrease dependence on primary mining. What do you think it's required to make circular economy really enter more effectively other streams of policies so that it doesn't really become a siloed approach?
I think part of the answer to that is that we need to have a shared understanding of what circularity and circular economy, what that actually is. Xavier was talking about the work ISO is doing on trying to define indicators and indicator sets. And that is one way of formulating what is circularity. There's a lot of work going on in UNEC and OECD. We did the work on what's called the Bellagio principles, trying to define what is circular economy, and that's underpinning all of these activities. So I think there is a conversation about what is circularity, and I think what I was trying to show with that first graph was that that hasn't permeated necessarily into the administrations in different countries, because I don't think anybody would say that a waste policy is not a circular policy if they really start to look at what is circular policies. So it's more an understanding issue. But if you then look at what is driving the Critical Raw Materials Act, then that is being driven by geopolitics. The war in Ukraine, meaning that there are certain things that we do not want to buy from Russia, the tensions that are building up with China on rare earth elements, and all of these types of supply disruptions. I mean, it's about protecting our way of life rather than about circular economy. And I think in that sense, we may even see that environmental policies more broadly are being put on, so we say, the back seat because there are other considerations, which I think is a disaster for the world in the longer run. But I can understand the political motive in the shorter term. And if you listen to Ernst in the plenary session earlier, what he was saying is that if you want to get elected, there are certain things you have to do, and that is very much about protecting the way of life that people is used to. So it's that kind of a conundrum where we have to get people to see that it's in their long-term interest.
Thank you very much. Timon, one question for you that I was thinking before. The G7, maybe going more on the international side, then we can, if there is time, going back to Germany. The G7 is, of course, the most powerful countries meeting together to discuss about the potential of the circular economy. On the other hand, there's also a growing research stream which is trying to put under the spotlight what could be the potential effects of high-income countries transitioning to a circular economy on low-income countries. So the countries which are currently the providers of raw materials in linear value chains, and of course, with full circularity in a kind of utopian scenario, and also with more self-sufficiency, these value chains would be disrupted with potentially some negative effects from an economic and social point of view on low-income countries. Was this part of the discussion? Is this something that was on the table? Maybe not as the core element I would expect, but there are any reflections about what does this entail in terms of international cooperation, international agreements, and current trade partners as well?
Yeah, thank you for the question. That's actually a quite relevant one, and I could go on for hours. I try to be brief. And also because I said earlier, with the G7, these are the most important industrialized states. Obviously, we have also China, India, others, those developing countries who are also major industry. So it would be better if that same, let's say, if the Berlin roadmap would have been a G20 product, would have been even better. And the Indian presidency this year of the G20 really had a quite ambitious approach to source efficiency in circular economy. They put it quite broadly on the agenda. That was extremely. I was really happy to see that. But you're right. Very often in international conversations, we do encounter some skepticism when it comes to partner countries who export a lot of resources, for example, to Germany, and then they basically say, "Okay, your idea seems to be that you just want to cut off the resource streams." And I think that really shows how important it is to do this together. And sometimes in, for example, G20 negotiations, there are certain fears or sometimes statements that sound a bit like circular economy was a European idea, just another one of those European ideas that Europe tries to kind of enforce on or force onto other partners. And that's really not what we're trying to do. Actually, there's great examples of countries in the global south who do their own circular economy projects, and these are extremely important. And we are thinking to cooperate more on these circular economy aspects of international trade. For example, one thing that you could think of is partnerships for recycled materials. I mean, it's not like, of course, we want to increase recycling in Germany, but it's not like every single recycled material has to be recycled in Germany. Can be done in other places or so as well. Obviously, we can also cooperate on technology. There's a lot of interest from international partners to cooperate on technology and also regulation. So this is really not it's not about protectionism or so, even though that there's fears on that. We really try to cooperate with our partners. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. And I think indeed it's including the others who are redesigning the value chains now and not making it a meeting behind closed doors. Nicholas, one question for you. Switzerland, as many, almost all of the European and high-income countries in the world have a resource use which is above the planetary boundaries. Basically, this is shown by different indicators. Now, we all know the circular economy has different strategies, so the famous Rs. And of course, starting from recycling and all of that, it's probably the easier step. How does the reduce concept enter in the circular economy in Switzerland? So really making sure that the circular economy cannot become an end in itself, but actually a tool towards reducing absolute levels of consumption. Does this play a role? Is there a discussion around it?
Yeah, you put the finger right into the wound. I mean, that's a big challenge to address this sufficiency side and the reduce side. And I also have to say, of course, it has its pitfalls if people and countries have different understandings of the circularity and circular economy. But one of the advantages is that it gives room to discussions that might otherwise not have place. So addressing sufficiency, for example, the Swiss Sustainable Development Strategy never mentions the word sufficiency. So it was not possible to integrate it. But since the circular economy gives room to the different R strategies, it's a possibility to talk about it and to also integrate it. Of course, when it comes to repair, and if you say prolonging lifetime of products, that goes also into this direction. And this is something that could be addressed by promotion and funding that could result from this parliamentary initiative that I was talking about. But also then, sufficiency and the overall environmental aspects and effects of consumption and behavior are still important, because the National Research Program that I've also mentioned, I think they have also a session, they showed that if people prolong the lifetime of their cell phones, they double it, they have more available income, and it very much depends on what they use it for. If they take the plane to Bali instead, it could even have a worse effect. So yeah, of course, the aspect of reduce, refuse, yeah, are a part that I think needs some time to develop, and maybe also needs this discussion around the circular economy to develop more.
Perfect, thank you. I mentioned indeed there was going to be a difficult question, so I hope that it gave you some seconds to prepare. Now, coming to you, Xaver, that's the difficult one for you. Taking the point of view that Pedro mentioned as well, there is a lack of a common understanding, which is a requirement, but the other end also creates a bit of a foggy environment. And there is now a little bit of growing concerns or criticism as well that the circular economy might just be becoming a marketing strategy, hindering true progress in favor of being more business as usual. This, of course, would be a catastrophic outcome. So what do you think is actually required, looking at all the elements that you presented before, to ensure that the circular economy does not end up being used as a greenwashing strategy, but a true driver for sustainable resource use?
I think we need clear goals for reduction of environmental impact. And for this, we are in need of indicators. And we must then monitor, based on these indicators, what is achieved over the years. And there is coming in another difficult element. You have very long time horizons. If you have seen from the GAP report over 5 years, no improvement. So it's really the question, are we in time for having a great impact? And for me, it's very important to take the important measures where you get most of reduction of environmental impact at lowest costs. I think many of the initiatives are functioning only due to subsidies. and a special field is the whole plastic thing. But at the end, I would like to make a comment to what Brigitte mentioned. I think business is really important. They can do a lot. And I was very much impressed what the cement industry in Austria has achieved. The president of the Austrian cement industry is also the president of the Resources Forum Austria. And they have achieved a huge amount of improvement for greenhouse gases. And it's not known outside of Austria. Yes, it should be promoted. I think that's really a good example where you have big impact. You have a lot of other initiatives where you have more or less no impact. But I think I would like that we conclude the discussion here and open the floor for the audience.
Indeed. Thanks a lot, Xaver. And I have one then final few words for each of you. But before we can open the discussion, we start a little bit later. So maybe we can go also 5 minutes above. And if you have any questions, and also if you have addressed to one specific person or just to the panel as such.
Brigitte, you said that industry was involved in your discussions, and you mentioned several of their concerns. One concern I was surprised not to hear was the international competitiveness. So this is at least something we always hear in Germany, and I don't want to judge whether it's justified or not. I would assume, at least in parts, it would be. Of course, there's always beating the drum is always important, but I imagine that this is an issue. And for example, if you use different materials for your furnaces, it may be more expensive, and so on and so on. So do you think this can be addressed on a national level, or would we need an international initiative of the EU and maybe even larger to make sure that even though we force industries maybe into more expensive processes, that they still can be competitive on an international level?
Of course, our industry is in strong competition with industry from other countries. So this is a topic of concern to them. When it comes to resources, Austria is a country we have to import many resources. And where there is a certain flexibility is where the resources come from, are in-country resources, and here are the non-metallic mineral resources. And there we see huge impacts when certain secondary resources are not available anymore. So I think we cannot say Austrian industry needs a very strong EU or international framework. And so I think the new initiative on, so I have to look for the German, for the English expression, Lieferkettengesetz, the Directive on Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence. I think this will be a very important framework to have to level the competition with production outside the EU. And the point is, I agree with you. It is a big topic. It is of big concern to our industry, but where they have the flexibility, they are, or what I want to point out again, where the state can set certain rules. For example, in the construction of buildings, there is then there are new market rules, and within these market rules, the industry strives for circular economy. I don't know whether I was completely clear. There is competition, but when there are strong rules, there are not, when unfair competition can be avoided, industry is willing to strive for circular economy targets. I think this is my conclusion I want to make.
Thank you. I would then suggest maybe for some misunderstandings over the lunch break, so it's a good occasion. Any other difficult questions from our panelists? Both questions and speakers, I think if we can keep it short and sharp, that's better. Yes.
Yeah, so it's a little bit building on what you said about due diligence, but where is the policy landscape around monitoring? You said due diligence supply chain. So I noticed there was a lot of policy indications around monitoring, but how do you then check that the data is valid? Essentially also the aspect of, is the data available? Again, a lot of these materials are coming from outside of your nation states. So how are you dealing with that from a nation policy basis to anyone?
Who wants to take it? Yeah, maybe a couple of 2, 3 views if you have, keeping them short.
I have an answer, but I don't know whether it is the answer to your question. We don't have a clear picture to monitor whether the we can monitor the amounts of imported goods, but we still do not have a clear, in Austria, we do not have a clear picture whether at a national level, whether the products are sustainable. What we do know that large industry in Austria, they have implemented their own monitoring of the supply chain to be sure that certain ores are not produced in mines with child labor. We do that there is, and we do know that companies are aware that there will be new obligations will be put on them for concerning their monitoring the supply chain. I don't know whether this is, I think this is a status as it is, but what I for sure can say, we don't have it at a national level, not yet.
Anybody else who wants to add anything on this topic? Peder first and then Timon.
The EU is doing some work around mainly about carbon emissions in order to be able to have carbon adjustments looking at the
CBAM mechanism.
Yeah, and that of course is trying to get a grip on what is going on. But if you look at the whole climate negotiations, then the whole thing about monitoring and verification around the world has always been, to put it bluntly, a mess. Because it's very, very difficult to get trustworthy data in certain parts of the world. So I think in reality, there's a long way to go before we have something that's trustworthy. There are a number of initiatives trying to set up international databases, but again, based on a number of studies and so on. So it doesn't necessarily entail real monitoring at a continuous basis.
Timon, if we can keep it quick, then we can have a couple of views. Timon and then Nicholas.
Yeah, just very quickly. I mean, much has been said already. Just on data and the quality of data, it obviously depends if that data is available nationally. So, for example, recycling rates or so. I think these are, in comparison, easy to track. I mean, there's issues sometimes, but comparatively easy. When it comes to due diligence across value chains, it's a bit more difficult. I mean, we have regulation in place on European level and also on national level on due diligence. And then the companies have to report on their due diligence requirements, what's then are audited externally. So this is the mechanism that we have to verify that these data are actually valid. But obviously, yesterday in the main program, we had this example of cobalt in the DRC. Then this clearly shows this system is far from perfect. So there's a lot of things that really slip outside of that system, and that's really an issue, and that's something we have to work on. But at least there is some monitoring, and it's also required by law.
Timon mentioned also that they had a side event at the COP meeting to integrate circular economy, resource efficiency, and climate. And I mean, in the whole climate negotiation, the only thing that it works is that there is like agreed upon a monitoring framework, and it's clear which data to develop. And I guess if in the future we want to go in the direction of combining resource efficiency, circular economy, and climate, I guess data availability, consistency, and harmonization is of great importance. And there are many multi-regional input-output tables, the material flow accounts, and every country calculates it differently. We have OECD database, ICIO, we have UNEP LCI with Gloria, we have Eurostat, Figaro, etc. And they all have advantages and disadvantages from a scientific point of view. That's also valid. But I guess if we want to also harmonize it and start really to integrate it into the international discussion, I think we have to think more about how to consolidate in the next couple of years.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Nicholas. For any other questions, I think all the speakers will be at lunch as well, so you can always feel free to intercept them and interrupt them. Not if they're speaking with others, maybe, but just if they're looking at their phone, maybe that's a good interruption. But as we are going to lunch, maybe we can leave with some final food for thought from each of you. I like concluding with maybe 30 seconds with the same question for all of the panelists. And the question is this one. We can start with you, Peter, and then we go to Xaver, West Country organized this workshop, and then it's, I think, fair that you have also the last words to conclude the session. Question is, the presentations that you all had at the European level in different countries have several positive aspects, which can be encouraging and also make us look with hope at the future. But I think we always need to ask ourselves, what can be the next step? How can we really increase our ambitions? And so what do you think can be the next step to increase the ambitions towards circular economy, but also towards what the circular economy can achieve, looking at the broader picture of the triple planetary crisis and resource use? Just 30 seconds, so we're not expecting a complete one.
I think one of the key challenges that we face is getting buy-in, getting people on board, getting people to understand that this is not just about the people sitting in the room here who do regulation. It's about individual actions. Individual actions count. We need to establish the proper frameworks for people to work within, but people also need to take this on board in their daily lives. And that's where the whole sufficiency discussion starts, with people also thinking about what it is that they need and they want.
Perfect. Thank you. Applause, we can leave it for after, but I think better appreciate it anyway. Brigitte?
What we see in Austria, we see the need to break down the national targets to economic sectors. And what we do have, we have a lack of knowledge which affects what we expect from economic or policy measures. And there our next step is, the vision is to integrate into socio-economic input-output models the satellite accounts for energy consumption, greenhouse gas emissions, and resource use. We do have it for climate, which allows us to simulate effects, and we want to have it also for the resource consumption to be able to have an idea what would be the effects of measures.
Thank you.
From a legislatory point of view, I guess what I presented before, like to raise the level of ambition, it's very important for our parliament to take a decision on its parliamentary initiative, so the federal council and the federal administration can build up on that. So that would be like one very important step. And Xavier before mentioned that the cement industry in Austria has done some good success. But I guess since it's about the whole cycle and the design phase is so crucial and important, I think the EU Commission said even it makes up for 80% of the environmental footprint of products. I guess when we stay in the construction sector, the design phase, so also the education and training of architects and planners, is of huge importance. And recently our office has published a report on that, also showing that there's like a bit of a gap, and there's a lack of knowledge in the area of greenhouse gas emissions caused by materials in buildings.
Yeah, actually, I'd like to build on what you said at the end, and I really think it's extremely important that we reach beyond our own bubble. I would include most people here also in the audience in this resources and circular economy world, but we also have to reach into the climate space, into the biodiversity space. So I would be very happy to also hear similar comments as we had today in the climate negotiations. I mean, obviously it's a small part and there's many other aspects, but at the last COP, it wasn't really a big topic. So side events is one thing, but we also have to get into the negotiations and into negotiated text. So that will be great because, as I said, circular economy is certainly not an end in itself. Thank you.
Xavier, please.
We take up your statement. We have to move out of the expert community. And this needs simplification. If I'm looking into ISO, there are only experts whose job is maybe to complicate it, not to simplify it. And we must have a common understanding. And there is this need of simplification that we can also communicate with business and even with society. So we need simple goals, we need simple indicators, and we must communicate these. That's my conclusion. And I learned a lot of this session, and it doesn't make it more easy for our report, which we will bring out. But thank you very much for your outstanding contributions, and thank you for being here in this workshop. So this would be my concluding remarks. Have good discussions during this conference and enjoy it. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you again, everybody. And I mean, good luck to Xavier probably for the completion of the report. That you should have probably some solutions, but probably it's even more than inputs to be taken into account. Thanks again for participating. Just also the people who are joining us online, a bit of a less relevant indication for the people online, but very relevant for you. There will be lunch now. So it's a 1.5 hours lunch. It's the first floor. There is the restaurant, so where there was the Aperol Rich yesterday. And you will receive a lunch ticket at the entrance, so then you can just do the normal round. So it should be straightforward. If there are some issues, ask some colleagues, not me. No, you can ask me as well, of course. But so thanks a lot, and then see you this afternoon.
An applause for the moderator.
No, it's